Have you ever wondered why, the moment a recession hits, governments suddenly start talking about spending trillions of dollars? Well, a huge part of the answer comes from one of the most influential and honestly most controversial economic theories ever dreamed up, Keynesian economics. It's an idea that completely flipped the script on how we think about economic crises, and it all started with a real-world puzzle that absolutely shattered the old way of thinking.
And here he is, the man himself, John Maynard Keynes. This quote, it's probably his most famous, and it gets right to the heart of his philosophy. See, while other economists were calmly talking about how markets would eventually fix themselves, Keynes was looking out the window at the real world. He saw the human cost, the closed factories, the desperation, and he basically said, waiting for the long run is a luxury we just don't have. To really get Keynes, you had to transport yourself back to the 1930s. The Great Depression wasn't just a bump in the road. It was a complete and utter global catastrophe. Everything was grinding to a halt. And suddenly, the economic rulebook that everyone had trusted for decades, it seemed totally, hopelessly useless. And this is where you really see the clash between theory and reality. For years, the prevailing wisdom, what we call classical economics, said that free markets always find their balance. If there's unemployment, hey, no problem. Wages will just fall until it's cheap enough for companies to start hiring again. Government should just keep its hands off. But that's not what was happening. At all. The economy wasn't correcting. It was spiraling downwards.
25%. Just let that sink in for a minute. 1 out of every 4 people who wanted a job couldn't find one. I mean, this wasn't just a statistic on a page. It was a full-blown societal breakdown. This one number screamed that something was fundamentally broken and the old theories had no answer for it. A new idea wasn't just wanted, it was desperately needed.
And into this chaos steps Keynes. In 1936, he drops a bombshell of a book, The General Theory, and it changes everything. Because he didn't just offer a new prescription for the economy's ills, he offered a completely different diagnosis of what was actually wrong in the first place. And this, right here, was the radical, game-changing insight. Keynes said, look, the problem isn't that we can't make things anymore. The factories were still standing, the workers were ready and willing. The problem was a total, catastrophic collapse in demand. No one was spending money, not people, not businesses, and if nobody's buying, well, then nobody's hiring. The entire economic engine had stalled. You see, what Keynes figured out, and this was huge, is that economies run on psychology just as much as they do on money. He saw that if everyone gets scared and expects bad times, they stop spending, they hoard their cash. But that action, multiplied by millions, causes the bad times. It's a vicious downward spiral, a self-fulfilling prophecy, where fear itself brings the whole system to a grinding halt. So, okay, if a collapse in demand is the disease, then what's the cure? Keynes' solution was just as radical as his diagnosis. And to get it, we need to pop the hood and look at the actual mechanics of what drives a modern economy. And that engine has a name: aggregate demand. It's a fancy term for a really simple idea: the total amount of spending in the entire economy. For Keynes, this was it. This was the master variable. If you want to know if the economy is healthy, you look at the level of aggregate demand. So what makes up this all-important number? It's basically 4 things. You've got consumption, that's you and me buying stuff. There's investment, that's businesses spending on new factories and equipment. Then there's government spending, everything from roads to schools. And finally, net exports. Add all those up and you get the total flow of spending that keeps the wheels of the economy turning. But you might be wondering, why do companies fire people? Why not just cut everyone's pay by, say, 10%? Well, Keynes had an answer for that. He talked about sticky wages. Think about it. In the real world, it's really hard to cut someone's pay. You've got contracts, minimum wage laws, and maybe most importantly, you'd have a huge morale problem. Wages just don't like to go down. So when a business needs to cut costs fast, the easiest, cleanest lever to pull isn't pay, it's people. Okay, now we get to one of the most powerful and honestly kind of hopeful parts of this whole theory, the multiplier effect. The idea is so simple but so profound. Every time one person spends $1, it becomes income for another person. That spending doesn't just stop. It creates a ripple that spreads through the whole economy. Let's just walk through it. Say the government spends $100 to hire a worker for a new project. That worker now has $100. They go out and spend, let's say, 80 of it at the local grocery store. Now that $80 is income for the shopkeeper. And what does she do? She goes and spends a chunk of that money. And on it goes. That initial $100 injection can actually create way more than $100 in total economic activity. That's the multiplier.
So this multiplier effect, this is the key that unlocks the whole Keynesian solution. Because if the private sector, that's all of us and all the businesses, is trapped in that cycle of fear, saving instead of spending, Keynes argued there's only one entity big enough and powerful enough to step in and start those spending ripples.
And that entity for Keynes was the government. This is the absolute core of Keynesian policy. If everyone else is pulling their money out of the economy, the government has to do the opposite. It must step in and become the spender of last resort to fill that demand gap and jolt the system back to life.
Now, the government has two main tools in its toolkit to do this. The first is fiscal policy. This is the direct stuff. The government just spends more money on things like roads and bridges, or it cuts our taxes so we have more money to spend. The other tool is monetary policy. This is more indirect. The central bank can lower interest rates to make it cheaper for all of us to borrow money and hopefully spend it. Keynes believed that in a really deep crisis, fiscal policy was the much more powerful weapon.
Now, this quote sounds completely absurd, right? Bury bottles full of cash. But Keynes was being provocative to make a very serious point. He wasn't literally saying we should bury money. He was arguing that when an economy is paralyzed by fear, the most important thing is just to get money moving again. The act of spending and creating any kind of job was more important than the specific thing being built, because it broke that psychological logjam. Of course, these ideas didn't just get accepted by everyone. Let's just say they were controversial. The history of Keynesianism has been a wild ride of incredible success, spectacular failure, and some pretty stunning comebacks. For a few decades after World War II, Keynes was king. His ideas were the standard playbook for pretty much every Western economy. But then the 1970s happened. A strange new beast called stagflation, that's high unemployment and high inflation at the same time, appeared, and standard Keynesian theory didn't have a great explanation for it. His ideas fell out of favor for a while, until 2008. When the global financial system nearly collapsed, suddenly, leaders all over the world dusted off the Keynesian playbook and launched the biggest stimulus programs in history.
And the critics have some really strong points you need to consider. The biggest one, of course, is debt. All that government spending has to come from somewhere, and it can lead to huge deficits. There's also the risk that if you pump too much money into the economy, you'll cause inflation. Plus, some argue that when the government borrows billions, it crowds out private companies, making it harder and more expensive for them to borrow and invest.
And this really gets to the heart of one of the deepest philosophical divides in economics. On one side, you have the Keynesians, who see a crisis as a problem that the government must actively solve. On the other side, you have schools of thought like the Austrians, who see a crisis as a kind of necessary, painful medicine to fix underlying problems. For them, government intervention just gets in the way and makes things worse in the long run.
And that leaves us with the big multi-trillion-dollar question that leaders are still grappling with every single time a crisis hits. Is that massive injection of government spending the essential cure that saves an economy from total collapse? Or is it a dangerous gamble that just kicks the can down the road, creating even bigger problems of debt and inflation for the future? The debate that John Maynard Keynes started almost a century ago, well, it's clearly far from over.